G'day, I'm Mr. Morosi. This project started when my mum saw this table online and asked if I could make her one. That amount of wood was going to cost almost as much as the table itself, so we abandoned the idea. That was 6 months ago, and it recently occurred to me I could just make it out of cheap timber offcuts. So the plan is to make it a surprise for Mother's Day. I just hope she still wants it. I need the offcuts to be square, so I can glue them together, and because I don't have a jointer, I figured going to a sawmill would be a good start. As it turns out, the offcuts at this mill aren't free, so I left $60 poorer with a small amount of wood that wasn't even square. The backup plan was a salvaged wood shop, which sell cheap offcuts, but after collecting a few bits and one nice length of cypress pine, I left again $100 down with not much wood. This isn't going well. Back in the workshop, I realised the wood I bought was too small, I also hadn't bought enough, and my plan for a cheap build was shattered. So I thought, bugger it, I'll double down and take my stash of recycled hardwood back to the shop and get it dressed square. After getting the timber dressed and spending a bunch more on clamps and glue, I was ready to make a top. I started by cutting the pieces into shorter lengths. Ideally, I would use a drop saw to cut the blocks I need, but I don't have one, so I had to make do with the table saw, which wasn't ideal as it meant making one cut and then flipping it to finish it off. I also quickly noticed I was running out of square-ish timber, so I raided the stockpile for anything that was dressed and continued cutting until I had a pile of nice-looking, odd-coloured, random-sized blocks. I'll be the first to say I'm not great at planning a project, and with all this random wood, it was pretty clear this isn't going to be the table my mum asked for. But she also doesn't know I'm making it, so may as well keep going. Because all the chunks are different sizes, I figured the best approach would be gluing long strips together and then laminating all of those strips to form the tabletop. I arranged the blocks, trying to keep it random, which is tough when there is heaps of one timber and not much of the others. I glued the blocks together against a fence to help keep them referenced when clamped. I should have used the salt trick here because keeping these things flat and square was a pain. And because I only bought 2 pipe clamps, it ended up taking 2 days. Once dried, I had a bunch of strips which couldn't be glued together. To fix this, I thought I'll cut the protruding bits off on the table saw. But shortly into the first cut, it wasn't feeling good. I was worried the glue wouldn't hold and chunks would be flying up into my face. Then I remembered I have a bandsaw. It might seem obvious, but when you are so used to not having something, you forget that it's even an option when you do have it, even when it's literally staring you in the face. I made sure the blade was square and that the saw was cantilevered on the most uneven part of my garage before cutting. It seemed like it was working well, and I was feeling hopeful until I noticed nothing was straight. The blade had wandered, causing these ridiculously wonky cuts, leaving huge gaps. I rearranged the pieces so that I could reduce the gaps and get more parallel surfaces to join for the glue up. It's now I realise, after all the cutting, the tabletop isn't even wide enough. So I threw in the most square piece of timber I had to bulk it out, which turned out to add some pretty nice contrast. I tested the arrangement a final time, and still wasn't sure if these gaps were going to work. But sometimes you just have to try. As a friend said to me recently, stuff your brain and go for it. I laminated the strips and ran out of clamps, so pulled out the old rope and twist trick, which I'd never seen or done before, and it worked really well. When it was all said and done, I had cracked one block from uneven clamping and left more gaps than a crocodile's smile. Luckily, they all stuck together, but I had an ugly block which needed some serious reinforcing. So after a rough planing, it was time to join the ranks of all modern woodworkers and crack out the resin. Some of you might say that blue tape isn't going to be enough. The surface is too uneven. It would be better to dam the holes with hot glue. And look, I had this thought as well, but I was still operating on a stuff your brain mantra, apparently. I'm using river table epoxy because I'm basically filling very small rivers. And the set time on this is also quite long, which means the deeper cracks can cure properly. After 30 minutes I kept scraping resin, but the gaps weren't filling. And as we all expected, it was flowing out the bottom. So in desperation, I taped some more. Rookie error. The next day it was still a bit runny, but I hoped it had set just enough to seal the bottom for another pour. They say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And so after another hour and more leaks, I changed up the variable and got my partner to do it while I drank my own cup of resin. I like projects which make me tap into different skills. I'm comfortable with the processes of wood, but I'm always looking to improve my metalworking. So while the resin sets, I started on the legs. I ordered pre-cut steel to save time and ground down the edges so the welds had a larger gap to fill. I haven't used this little gasless MIG welder for strip welds like this, so it took a bit of trial and error to get the settings right. It had also been a while between drinks, so the quality between the first leg and the last welds were noticeable, but that's nothing a grinder can't fix. While I continue to weld on top of that cool looking table, you might want to hit subscribe so I know that you want me to remake this table in a video after I trash it. I tried using a block to keep the height of the tabs consistent, but made an absolute dog's breakfast out of it. So back to basics. Nothing beats the tried and tested measure and check square. I tacked the tabs which would hold the timber top with shorter welds so they wouldn't be visible from the outside edge. While welding the legs together, you might notice that they magically started to go for a walk. That's okay, I noticed it too. I'm just hoping the tabletop will push them back into line. In just the nick of time, I finished the welding and it started pissing down. Everyone agrees, with the exception of eels, that electricity and water don't mix. But grinders are okay, so I cleaned up the welds and called it a day. Now I'm not sure if it's from the fumes or the sparks, but all the timber anywhere near the legs went grey. So if you know why that is, let me know in the comments. I had it on good authority that if you want to remove the mill finish from the steel, then you should soak it in vinegar overnight. But after doing this and giving it a quick rub with steel wool and sanding it 240 grit, I'm not sure it made much of a difference. To prep for painting, I gave it a good once over with acetone to remove any grease and vinegar and hung it up out the back. This particular metal spray apparently didn't need a primer, so I gave it 2 coats and let it dry for a couple of days. When you have a small shop and you try different projects, you inevitably have to make something to get the job done. It's just the simple joy of making. In this case, I don't have a thicknesser, and although I do know a guy, I wanted to make a router sled to flatten the tabletop and see what that was all about. With a few offcuts, I screwed and glued some rails to a sheet of ply, so I had a flat surface to work with. I put together a sled from more form ply offcuts and cut a hole in the middle for the huge 50mm surfacing bit to drop through. From what I saw on YouTube, adding paste wax to the underside makes it slide better. Like a sugar-loaded child on Christmas, I ripped the tape off to reveal where all my resin went and got to work flattening. You might notice a few burn marks, and that's because my router was too fast for the max RPM of my flattening bit. But I managed to get these out later on with a final really shallow pass. If it wasn't for the rain, I would have done this outside. I'm just happy I had the foresight to wrap up my shop because there was sawdust in nooks and crannies not really appropriate to mention on YouTube. Another tool I don't have is a track saw. So with my little Makita, I made one cut on a DIY track and flipped it over to finish it off. Foolishly, I hoped I could cut the other side on the table saw, but that was silly. So I just repeated the cut and flip on the remaining 3 sides. Working my way up the grits, the table was starting to look good. But the more I sanded, the more holes I noticed. So I taped around the cracks to stop the resin from staining the top. The cracks were deeper than I thought, so I mixed and re-poured 2 or 3 times. After a final sand, I knocked the edges off with a block plane to keep the dimensions sharp. Because the table is mostly end grain, I'm going to use hard wax oil, which I haven't used before. It should be able to soak deep into the fibres and create a hard protective coating on the top. I gave the underside 1 coat because this is expensive stuff. The top and sides got 3 coats, giving it a light sand between the coats. When everything was dry, I popped a couple of threaded inserts underneath and screwed it to the base. After all was said and done, I'm pretty happy with the result. Yeah, sure, we made a few mistakes, but for something built between a garage and a back veranda, it'll pass mustard. But the question remains, did I make the designer coffee table my mum wanted? Thanks for watching.